Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful Wednesday webinar with the wisdom today from Adam Greenfield, who is the author of Lifehouse, Taking Care of Ourselves in a World on Fire. And he's got a lot of practical information about many very interesting movements close to our hearts, from the Black Panthers to Occupy Sandy to the Rojava horizontal organising ways of doing things. So really excited to hear what Adam's got to say tonight. So Adam, thank you very much for coming. Over to you. Over.
Thanks so much, Phoenix. And thanks everybody for making some time for this on your Wednesday evening. I really appreciate the attention that you're lavishing on this subject matter, particularly as it's subject matter which many people find distressing, many people find troubling or even overwhelming. And very, very centrally, part of my intention in writing this book and sharing this material is to help people deal with that sense of being overwhelmed and not knowing quite how to respond to the circumstances that we find ourselves presented with. My hope is by offering some concrete proposals for action. There is no specific for the sense of dread and being overwhelmed like doing something. And my hope is very, very much that we each of us find something to do about the crisis that we find ourselves in now. It almost, and I'll be very clear about this, it almost doesn't matter to me what. Clearly, I've got ideas, which I'm more than happy to share with you. But it almost doesn't matter to me what it is that you're doing, as long as you're doing something. It is the passivity and it is that sense of helplessness that I find so heartbreaking and so troubling, and which I think probably does not spell anything very good for us. But by contrast, when we do get actively involved, as almost all of you, I'm sure are, um, I think we have a chance of seeing our way through these next difficult years and decades with, as I always say, with our notions of dignity and justice intact, as well as survival. I want to make a couple of notes real quickly about language. This is already cropped up in a couple of ways. First, let me say also, um, forgive me if I personally seem a little bit reserved or off a little bit at the moment. I have just suffered a bereavement in my family. My ex-wife, unfortunately passed away very young at 56 from complications of a cluster of autoimmune disorders of the type which I think medicine does not take particularly seriously. And I find that very sad and very distressing. And I'm choosing actually to work through that grief because I think I could not possibly have come up with a better illustration of what it is that our times call for from us. These are times in which we will suffer compound grief, grief that we do not get to mourn, that we do not get to fully experience fully before the next occasion for sorrow is on us. And the lesson I'm trying to learn from this is that how do you give full scope to that feeling, to be emotionally present to it, to feel everything that it has to teach you, and to keep working through it, not pushing it to one side, not doing the kind of Western workaholic thing where we just kind of bull onward through it, but to take it on board, to allow it to unfold, to remember those that we've lost, and yet to keep our attention on the work as well. So I ask that you remember that as I speak tonight, if I feel like I'm not quite fully there.
Um, Adam, just a quick technical point. Shane just asked if I could turn the volume up. My volume's maximum. If you could speak a little louder, and everyone turn your volumes up max on your computers. Over.
I shall do. I'm already projecting with my full former sergeant's voice. But I will I'll endeavor to keep speaking as loudly as I possibly can. The other note on language, I don't use terms that are familiar to most of us from these discourses. I particularly don't use the word resilience for the very simple reason, and I think this is becoming rather commonly accepted and widely shared, that resilience implies that we're bouncing back to a status quo ante, a state of things as they are before. And I think that we share the sense in this space that the way things are is not just. is not equitable, and in fact is compounded of circumstances that have led us to the moment that we're in. I have no desire to bounce back to that state of affairs. I have no desire for resilience. What I want is to push through and to collectively discover an entirely new way of being on the earth together, which is, by the same token, a very old way of being on the earth together. And I think what I mean by that will become clear. If you'll forgive me, and again, my very strong sense is that I'm not presenting anything that folks in this space have not already thought through and felt through. And you'll have to forgive me if there's a quality of redundancy to what I'm offering you. But I'd like to begin by reading a passage from the introduction to the book, which will explain how it is that I got interested in this space to begin with, why I think we need to be establishing physical spaces in each of our communities that we can use to shelter more of us from more of the things that are falling on us, why I think those spaces need to be democratically self-managed, and why I think we need to take on the challenge of learning how to steward our way through the storms ahead, regardless of what kinds of experiences we may have had in the past, or what indeed we expect from the systems which currently furnish us with the makings of a decent life. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction. We were out of town when Superstorm Sandy made landfall on New York City, my partner and I, and had trouble catching a flight home. So what I recall most vividly about the event itself was the disorientation of seeing the view from our own apartment window beamed around the world on CNN. There it was, the familiar intersection in front of our building, flooded waist high. The traffic signals were swinging wildly on their mast arms overhead, in what an excited voiceover described as sustained winds of 40 miles an hour or more. A montage of increasingly surreal footage followed. The tide overtopping a seawall somewhere out in the Rockaways. Torrential floodwaters surging into the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. Then a construction crane snapped in two by the wind, dangling 75 stories above Midtown. And finally, that unforgettable image of Lower Manhattan, the whole bottom third of the island gone dark after a transformer explosion at the Con Ed electrical substation on East 14th Street. This was plainly no ordinary hurricane. Even before its surge hit New York City, Sandy was already strikingly unusual. The lead winds of a late-season storm, among the largest Atlantic hurricanes on record, had begun to fuse with an existing continental cold front, producing something vastly larger and weirder than either. The combined system would go on to loiter over the northeastern United States for days, stretching ordinary expectations of a weather event to the breaking point, and in doing so, defining an entirely new category of superstorm. But it was the storm surge, when it came, that literally redrew the maps. Measured at its peak at the Battery at a previously unimaginable 4.2 meters, or some 2.1 meters above flood stage, it was this surge, far more than the rain or the wind, that caused the most severe and lasting damage. As the brackish water streamed inland, it flooded into subway tunnels, utility vaults, basements, and hundreds of thousands of other below-ground spaces. The Hudson and East Rivers overspilled their banks, as did smaller waterways like the heavily polluted Gowanus Canal. Low-lying areas of New York City, from Manhattan's financial district to the beach communities of outer Queens, suddenly found themselves submerged beneath a filthy, freezing tide. It was more than any of the planners, architects, or civil engineers responsible for the city's form had ever anticipated, and in the end, it was more than the infrastructures they devised could withstand. Failure cascaded through a tight mesh of systems critical to the life of the city, that on any ordinary day ran quietly in the background. Power, fuel, transportation, and communication networks all went down, despite the backups and failovers that had been so carefully designed into them. In the worst hit neighborhoods, they stayed down for weeks. In New York City alone, tens of thousands of households found themselves without light, heat, or potable water. Elderly people and others with limited mobility were trapped on high floors in their thousands, marooned atop 20 and 30-story buildings whose elevator service was not restored for a week or more. Entire housing projects were left to fend for themselves, the maintenance crews responsible for their upkeep and repair stranded off-site by the collapse of the regional transportation network. Attempts to restore service struggled against acute and immediate fuel shortages amid lengthening lines and spreading mayhem at gas stations. And in true insult to injury style, there was barely time for anyone to internalize any of this before a vicious early cold snap settled onto the area. By the time my partner and I made our way back to New York, it was already clear that Sandy would turn out to be one of those events that rewrites the way we understand the world we live in, like the 500-year floods or wildfires that now seem to strike every few months. The appearance of this storm suggested that the atmosphere had undergone a transition to a volatile new state, in which weather events of a magnitude once thought impossible were plainly now on the table, and those that had been considered exceptional would become routine. It was one of those moments of ruthless clarity, a meteorological disturbance so massive that it defied classification, difficult to attribute with any credibility to anything but human action, had landed on the very capital of empire. And in a matter of hours, it had laid waste to all the intertwined systems that kept it functioning. Maybe it is simply that all of this happened to a place as comprehensively mediated and as endlessly baroquely self-mythologizing as New York City. But at least for those of us who found ourselves living through its after effects, Superstorm Sandy felt like some kind of rupture or punctuation in history. The advent of a new era in which the contours of everyday life everywhere on Earth would fundamentally be determined by the consequences of anthropogenic global heating. It will never be possible to point to a given day on the calendar and say, yes, that's when everything started to change. And in any event, I expect that moment would be different for each one of us. If you were forced to choose a single event, though, a single nodal point at which one set of assumptions about how the future might unfold was replaced wholesale by another, you could do a whole lot worse than this one. Most of the ways in which Sandy reset our expectations about the world we live in were scary and hard to accept, but not all of them. If there was one bright light that kept burning amid the devastation, it was that there was in New York an organization able to stand up a logistical network and begin relief and recovery operations almost immediately. This organization had 2 distribution hubs set up before the last of Sandy's trailing winds had quite cleared the tri-state area. It funneled an enormous volume of donated goods and supplies out to the hardest hit areas of the city. It furnished crew after crew of volunteers willing to take on the difficult, dirty, and occasionally dangerous job of site clearance. And it took on responsibility for providing thousands of displaced, traumatized New Yorkers with shelter, warmth, sustenance, and fellowship. The organization I'm talking about wasn't FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency formally chartered by the United States government to respond to large-scale disasters, whether natural or man-made. And it wasn't the National Guard. Nor was it the Red Cross, the superficially benign philanthropy blandly familiar to generations of Americans for its role in distributing blankets and food parcels in the wake of crisis. In fact, it was neither a government agency nor a charitable effort of any kind. It was a spontaneous, self-organized initiative assembled in real time by veterans of the previous year's Occupy Wall Street movement and consciously guided by the anarchist ideals and values of that movement. It was called Occupy Sandy. Occupy Sandy was simply the easiest, fastest, and most effective way for an ordinary, unaffiliated New Yorker to get involved with the relief effort in the hours and days following the superstorm's landfall, whatever their political convictions. That I am aware of, it was the only organization that had meaningful and productive things for people without specialized skills to do in the city's moment of maximum need. The only one with the capacity to absorb the massive incoming flows of volunteers, supplies, and financial contributions, and the network to direct those materials and energies to the places where they could do the most good. Some numbers will begin to suggest the magnitude of the things these unpaid amateurs accomplished together on an improvisational basis without anything in the way of leadership, institutional infrastructure, existing financial resources, or prior planning. Within a week of the peak storm surge, Occupy Sandy had 700 core members working out of two repurposed churches in the Brooklyn neighborhoods of Clinton Mill and Sunset Park, and was serving approximately 20,000 meals a day across a far-flung constellation of 30 or more local recovery centers stretching across the New York City area, so from Red Hook to New Dorp. By the end of November 2012, the initiative could marshal some $700,000 worth of supplies and equipment, and ultimately collected more than $1.3 million in donations intended to support its efforts. All told, some 60,000 volunteers were eventually involved in this bottom-up relief effort in one way or another, roughly 4 times the number fielded by the American Red Cross, bringing with them insights and perspectives from all walks and strata of New York City life. I was one of them, and for the first time in my life, I was in a position to do something about the consequences of global heating. In the end, my involvement with Occupy Sandy was comparably shallow. All told, it amounted to perhaps 2 weeks of shifts at the 520 Clinton Avenue distribution hub, participation in a few of the general assemblies, at which the community reported back to itself what it had learned and decided on courses of future action, and an unforgettable Christmas Eve, huddled on a freezing church porch that still smelled of a recent firebombing attempt, singing carols and old wobbly songs with the other volunteers there that night. What I saw during these few hundred hours, though, did as much to transform my sense of what ordinary, untrained people could achieve together as anything else I've ever experienced. For my entire adult life, I had been told that the principles of self-organization I believed in were childish, impractical, utopian fantasies that might work tolerably well in small groups of people who already held similar political commitments, but couldn't possibly do so at scale among significant numbers of normal citizens. And yet here was the most concrete proof possible that these same ostensibly impractical principles could successfully be used to coordinate a highly complex and occasionally life-critical effort consistently and for a number of months across the largest and most demographically diverse metropolitan area in North America. If anybody doubted that self-organized, non-hierarchical mutual aid projects could respond to catastrophe every bit as effectively as official disaster relief agencies, if not, in many cases, markedly more so, their questions ought to have been resolved by Occupy Sandy. That ordinary New Yorkers could organize themselves to achieve something this complicated and difficult under immense pressure put flesh on the bones of my fundamental belief in undirected human capacity. That they could do so with the most limited means, in the face of opposition that ranged from patronizing skepticism to outright arson, said something impressive about their ability to make sound collective decisions despite the pressure. And for this kind of order to arise spontaneously in the early aftermath of the most significant natural disaster in the city's living memory strikes me as nothing short of astounding. I doubt that there are 60,000 convinced anarchists in New York City. There may not even be a tenth that number. But there are 60,000 who did anarchy all through the storm and the months that followed, and did so brilliantly. And perhaps this offers us a more general template for ways in which we might organize our communities so that they shelter more of us from more of the hard times ahead. But what if it's pointing at something even deeper than that? What if organizing ourselves in this way also helps to repair other, more chronic insults to our well being? The overwhelming sense of powerlessness we so often contend with, the dread of the future we barely manage to tamp down, even the damage inflicted upon us by the ordinary disasters of everyday life. What if the experience of coming to the aid of our community affirms us in ways we might not have dared to ask for or even imagined possible? In her 2009 book, A Paradise Built in Hell, the writer Rebecca Solnit discusses just this aspect of efforts that arise in the aftermath of disaster. She writes movingly of the joy one can take, even in the midst of catastrophe, from inhabiting for the first time a civic self, a self rooted in the provision of communal care, one that seems infinitely larger and more capacious than those narrower selves that are invoked by work, family life, consumerism, therapy culture, or identity politics. And she goes on to quote the American sociologist Charles Fritz to the effect that the widespread sharing of danger, loss, and deprivation produces solidarity among the survivors, which overcomes social isolation, provides a channel for intimate communication and expression, and a major source of physical and emotional support and reassurance. This isn't some sociological theory of the wouldn't it be lovely to think so variety, but a consistent empirical observation. Consider what John P. Clark related about his experience of the Common Ground mutual aid effort that arose in New Orleans following 2005's Hurricane Katrina. Volunteers and survivors often describe the experience of a break with conventional reality and the emergence of a new time and space of possibility. The sense of an opening that Clark reports chimes in every detail with what the artist and activist Cassie Thornton found in her visits to the solidarity clinics of austerity-stricken Greece in January 2017. I met a group of middle-aged women who cited the crisis as the birth of their new lives as radicalized people within activist communities, people who had found a purpose, who are now more than just workers and consumers. They felt powerful, connected, and interdependent for the first time. People who participated in these efforts consistently experienced the feeling of interdependence as healing at both the individual and communal levels. People's differences went by the wayside, said one Occupy volunteer who spent 3 months working in the hardest hit areas of the Rockaways. This same volunteer went on to note the curious fact that the opportunity to contribute to the relief effort was itself part of the relief it furnished. Helping others became a major coping mechanism for many people. It's much better to have them empowered rather than having these people stand in a line to beg for aid. Perhaps most poignant of all is the stark contrast between the sense of empowerment Solnit, Clark, Thornton, and this unnamed Occupy volunteer all mention, and the pursuits that are supposed to produce meaning and value in the rest of our lives. When Clark says that in the provision of mutual aid, one could experience one's own activity as intrinsically valuable, the strong implication is that the things we ordinarily do, that we have to do in order to keep a roof over our families' heads and food on the table, are not experienced in that way. The crux of this isn't simply, as Charles Fritz was given to pointing out, that the everyday ongoing life of the society is its own kind of quiet disaster. It's that the way that the society is currently organized affords us very few opportunities to step outside the identities we've so carefully shored up and simply show up for the people who need what we have to offer. It was just such an opportunity that Occupy Sandy extended. If you've ever given blood, maybe you'll recognize those aspects of the way it felt to work at 520 Clinton, that it mattered, that there was no detectable downside to it, and whatever good came of it had not a thing to do with who I thought I was, who the world perceived me to be, or how I preferred to present myself. And in this, there is a clue as to what form our response should take when the excursion from normalcy lasts not just the weeks or months it might take to rebuild after a storm, but forever. You may have noticed that certain words crop up again and again in participants' accounts of mutual aid efforts. They are the exact same things I personally experienced in the course of my own involvement with Occupy Sandy: purpose, power, possibility. That these are the qualities that stand out in personal narratives of mutual aid work, to the point that people thought they were worth mentioning, suggests just how much we suffer from the pointlessness of the work most of us are ordinarily required to do, as well as the broader passivity and isolation to which our usual roles in life have consigned us. But the same accounts also suggest that something profound seems to happen in the moments after some catastrophe has disrupted the ordinary flow of life, in which we stop waiting for rescue and commit ourselves to collective reparative action. The choices we make in these moments evidently have the power to bind up other, seemingly unrelated wounds. They may even open onto entirely new ways of being in the world. To me, the implications of this extend far beyond either mutual aid or disaster relief in the very strictest sense of those terms, and invite us to think expansively about what such efforts might mean when unfolded to their fullest extent in a world where so many of the old certainties no longer apply. What I am proposing is that the most productive way of addressing each of the intertwined crises that confront us, the fundamental planetary one of climate system collapse, yes, but also the dread and the powerlessness and even the inordinate difficulty we so often seem to have now in communicating across the genuine differences that cleave us. Well, the most productive way of addressing all of these crises consists in our application of one and the same strategy. And happily, this strategy also happens to be the one most immediately accessible to us. It lies in organizing ourselves to take care of one another without waiting for anybody to issue that care to us as generic subjects, sell it to us as consumers, or offer it to us as passive recipients of a charity bestowed from above. In other words, finally doing something about the straits we're in directly and in our own neighborhoods in ways that call upon all the resources and capacities the roles we play in everyday life have no need of and place no value upon. Who knows, but that we may finally find selves that we recognize, even here in the most difficult and challenging hours of our lives. And that is the project of the book. Um, I'm very, very happy to go into what I actually do discuss in the rest of the book and propose in the section on the Lifehouse itself that culminates the book. But I'm also really mindful that we've got people here with a lot of experience in building just such spaces and just such contexts for people to experience this kind of purpose, power, and possibility. And what I'd love to do is get a sense of the room as to whether you'd like to hear from me a little bit more, or whether we should open it up to a more general discussion and see what people have to offer.
Okay, folks, any feedback on that? Just use reactions to raise your hand if I come off that so we can see any feedback. I'd like to hear a little bit about Rojava, Adam. That's a very important organising movement that I'd like to see replicated in many more places across the planet, shall we say. Just going to come off the direct view of Adam. Do you want to put a hand up and make a suggestion, anyone there, or speak up? Let me just see if I can come off. No work coming off Adam. How do we want to run this?
Phoenix, while you're collating those, why don't I address the question about Rojava, because it's also very near and dear to my own heart. Rojava.
Good no, my colleague. I mean,
One sec. Somebody's got muted. I think that might be Moby that just arrived. Carry on, Adam.
Sure.
Put something in the chat, folks, about what you think we should do. More conversation or opening from Adam, or opening up to everyone to chat. There is a possibility of breakout rooms as well. Adam, sorry, back to you. Over.
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about Rojava because it's very, very close to my heart. The book is organized in 4 chapters and a conclusion. And the 4 chapters, the first of them, nobody in this space really needs to read at all, to be honest. It will be completely redundant for you. It's called The Long Emergency, and it is an attempt to dissect the straits that we're in. I think people here understand that it isn't simply global heating that we're talking about, but really the second and third order nonlinear consequences of that heating for the social, economic, political, psychological systems that bind us together and produce everyday life, that are at risk. And so that's what that first chapter is about. The second chapter is called Mutual Care, in which I begin to look at not merely mutual aid. I'm sorry, could the person who's just come in please mute themselves because I'm getting some crosstalk.
Okay, I'm looking for them.
That'd be great, thank you. What it looks like when, mutual aid, most of the mutual aid projects I discuss in the book are admittedly of, weeks or months in duration. And I think something else begins to happen when you need to apply these techniques over years. I think there are different resources that are called upon and different ways of organizing. And so I look not merely at these kind of climate and storm-based disaster relief and recovery operations, but 2 other examples that were more chronic, both that of the Black Panther survival programs in the United States in the early 1970s, which were a heroic set of measures and provisions for community survival that included breakfast programs and free food programs, educational programs, healthcare and screening clinics that were organized in the poor Black communities of the cities of the United States, which already would have been challenging enough. But all of this was organized under the extreme adversarial pressure of something called COINTELPRO, which was a very concerted and very well-resourced effort on the part of the United States government to disrupt these activities, to undermine them, to prevent them as a potential for community organizing, and to physically destroy many of the individuals involved. So I first looked at the Black Panther survival programs as a place where we might learn some lessons about what it is really to organize under heavy manners and for the long term. From there, we moved to Greece, where, again, it's a slightly different kind of crisis. In this case, it's a financial crisis. Literally 3 lines in the agreement that the Greek state signed with the European Central Bank doomed that economy to a massive contraction, the largest contraction of a northern global north economy in peacetime in world history. And the consequences of that, among other things, were bringing down the national health network. So the Greek solidarity networks, again, organized over the long term for the physical provision of food and well-being and healthcare for something like 30% of the Greek population. So this was a very large-scale effort that was maintained over the reasonably long term with fantastic consequences. That's the chapter called Mutual Care. But then there's a question which arises, which is that there is a lesson of all of these programs and activities, which is that if you organize in people's defense, if you do something even so seemingly uncontroversial as offering food to the poor, you will be opposed. You will be opposed by force, and there will be people who will come after you. And so I began to think of care and power as in a reciprocal relationship with one another, that care is the way in which we maintain our collective power, but power exerted outward creates an internal volume, a space in which we can care for one another, and reproduce our ability to resist those who would undermine our efforts and attempt to do us harm. And so I began to look at self-organized systems of political power. At the time that I was writing the book, libertarian municipalism was still quite a going concern. And in fact, we have reason to believe that there may still be some life left in it. So I look at the municipalist systems in Spain, particularly in the cities of Spain, and how they fared when, I regard municipalism as kind of it's anarchism's accommodation of the local electoral state for the purpose of getting some very anarchist things done, and with mixed results in Spain, certainly. The shining example of the chapter on power is Rojava, is the 3 breakaway provinces of northern Syria in the time following the Syrian civil war. And what astonishes me to this day, it's possible even in this group, there are people who may not be familiar with the story of Rojava, with exactly what happened there, even though we're talking about, a couple of million people over the size clearly of a small nation, lasting around 10 years. How is it that these people came together and managed to organize an eco-feminist and anarcho-socialist society in the middle of a civil war, whilst under attack not merely by Daesh, what's called in the West ISIS, so some pretty bad people, and the state military of Turkey as well. How is it that people came together, organized the defense of their communities, the provision of bread, the apportionment of justice, and the development of a common social life there? And it is in a detailed accounting of all of these systems that people arrived at, the local councils, the assemblies, the justice platforms. I go into quite a good bit of detail in the book as to how all of these things worked to produce not merely a massive feminization and diversification of justice, but an opening, an invitationality, so that where originally we might have regarded the utopian aspects of what happened in Rojava as a strictly Kurdish affair, the tremendously diverse panoply of ethnicities and backgrounds that constitutes that part of northern Syria found that this way of doing things was in fact so productive, so useful, so effective, that it truly became a multi-ethnic and invitational project. I do not want to look at it with rose-colored glasses. If there's anything I'm good at, it is in seeing, even in the things that I think have the most to teach us, there are always inevitably ways in which they fall short. There are always inevitably blind spots that any human collectivity has. And I'm not into painting anybody as beyond reproach or beyond critique. But I have to say that the experience of what's called the autonomous administration of northeastern Syria, formerly, that we know as Rojava, is amongst the most inspiring stories of my entire lifetime. It is something that fills me with a physical glee every single time I hear about it, every single time I read about the things that are done there. And that glee, as with the other sorts of surging, upwelling energy that I talk about in the book, is something that has concretely and materially given me the strength to do things in my own life and organizing in my own communities. It is such an incredible story, despite whatever drawbacks there may be, whatever blind spots they might have. It is such an incredible story. And the fact that so few people know about it and it is so rarely discussed is just one of the major lacunae of our period on Earth. And it is that which I had hoped to redress just a little bit in the chapter in the book that's on that, which is called Collective Power.
Adam, I think that's a good point. There's so much here. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I know there's probably some folks with some questions. I think we've managed to find a Rojava link to pop in there. Happy to flow on for longer tonight. You know, some people may have to get at some point, but shall we go to some questions? And, you know, obviously, if people want to do a breakout later, happy to carry on. I mean, there's a lot of people in the room who've got a lot, you know, I would love to ask you a question. It could be a question, a comment, and feedback. Is that okay, Adam, to move to the Q&A?
Absolutely. All I ask is that people be mindful that apparently there's a lot of people with a lot of questions. So if it's more of a comment than a question kind of a thing, maybe consider leaving that until after people have had their opportunity to ask questions. And, you know, people who are really in search of some kind of dialogue there. I would really personally appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Okay, folks, thank you very much, Adam. It's amazing. So just say down the bottom, there's this reaction tab. If you click raise a hand there, you can see who is 1, 2, or 3. So if you've got a question, or as we say, it can be feedback or comment, but bear in mind we've got 45 in the room, so be succinct, which means being short with your comments. Okay, floor is open. Anybody who wants to make a comment, feedback, or question? Okay, don't all jump at once. I might just jump in and give a couple of feedbacks while they get their hands up.
I
Just
see,
to
I
say
see
a couple of
Anne,
bits.
I see
start.
Anne has got a hand up. So yeah.
Okay, let's go with Paolo, then Shane. I'll pop something in third. Anyone else? Put your hands up. Okay, Paolo, go for it.
Sorry, I've lost it, but there was a woman before me with her hand raised, but
That
not.
would be Anne, I think. Anne Link, yeah.
Anne, okay, well spotted.
Okay.
Anne, go for it if you want to go on the yeah, that way. Go for it. Well done, Paolo. Anne, over. You have to unmute.
Yes, I have unmuted. I wondered how long I put this in the chat as well. What was there a long-term effect of the 60,000 volunteers? You know, how much their lives were changed? Well, obviously it got you writing this book, but did that go on, or, you know, were the forces that kind of made it disintegrate after a while? And also, is Rojava still in existence, carrying on?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, so I can answer both of those questions. There was no standing long-term solidarity infrastructure that came out of Occupy Sandy. And that is indeed part of the reason why I wrote the book. Because what a tragedy and a missed opportunity that feels like to me. I obviously can't speak to internal transformations or psychic transformations that and I have to imagine that there are, you know, clearly many people who are part of that effort or who were exposed to it who have a different sense of doing things now. But it is with some slight regret that I see that there hasn't been any attempt really to extend the logic that drove Occupy Sandy to a more permanent way of organizing the necessities of everyday life. What I will say is that for better or for worse, mutual aid is now almost a habit. Anytime a storm, I mean, you know, these networks arise very quickly out of existing solidarity networks in the North American continent. Certainly for the twin hurricanes we had last month, Helene and goodness, I'm going to blank on the name of the other one. Milton, thank you. Helene and Milton, they sound like my aunt and uncle from Queens. You know, from the mutual aid efforts that popped up in the wake of those storms were immediate, and they were immediate because we had already sort of laid down these pathways and forged these relations with one another at kind of a demi-continental scale. My hope had been that there would be a broader application of mutual aid and the values underlying it to our sustenance. And I haven't seen so much of that, but I think we're beginning to see weak signals of that cropping up around the edges. Certainly, it's hard to distinguish things which are driven by the values which animate mutual aid, sometimes from charitable or philanthropic efforts. It would be hard to tell if a local food bank, for example, is organized on mutual aid lines, or maybe has more of a philanthropic or a charitable spin to it. I mean, obviously, during COVID in the UK, there were a lot of mutual aid groups that stood up, but we're beginning to see this language become more general, and it's definitely part of my hope in writing the book, to give people access to that toolkit, and to furnish once again some of these ideas and the motivations behind them, such that people can pick them up and make use of them in whatever context they see fit. With Rojava, it's been very hard for me to tell that story with any justice, because I've never set foot there, and I am perforce compelled to rely upon the accounts of people coming back from there who have different political tendencies and different motivations. Some people kind of want to talk them down because they didn't adopt one or another political viewpoint that the person speaking thinks they ought to have. My personal sense is, by talking to people who are from there, as well as people who are coming back from there, my sense is that since the Turkish invasion of late 2019, it has been they're sort of on the back foot, and it's been very, very difficult to organize affirmatively an infrastructure of everyday life in the way that was the case between 2014 and 2019. I'm completely prepared to be wrong about that. I would love to be wrong about that. I just haven't seen any evidence that fills me with a whole lot of hope that there's the same kind of ferocious innovation coming out of there that there was. I think that chunks of the three cantons have been carved off. There have been, major losses from combat. There has been an attrition of the best and brightest of the society, because everybody there is resisting the physical assault on them on a daily basis. So my sense is that they've got a lot on their plate and haven't begun to do the work of developing the society in quite the way I had hoped. I think they've achieved quite a lot already, and again, under quite a good amount of pressure. And they don't have to do a single further thing in order for me to regard it as just one of the most successful projects in autonomy and human liberation I've ever seen, and that I think we can learn from. My hope for them is that they prevail, clearly, with the righteous, with the success of the righteous, because I
Long live the Rojava team. They're
Yes.
breaking many new cutting edge of change. Should we come up to Roman there? I think he's got a question from Cooperation Hull, if he's still up Hull Way Row, and then James, and then Helen.
we also Pablo wasn't there?
Oh, Paolo. Sorry, his hand's gone down, and Paolo, then Roman, then
He was
James.
so patient.
Paolo.
We should.
Yeah, no, good one.
Sorry, yeah, no, okay, just quick. You are the second witness to Sandy that I have personally, well, I haven't met you personally. I met a guy, he was from Dublin, he was a student in New York at the time, and he told a very similar story to what you've witnessed. My question was, because I followed your interview on the New Books Network the other day, and you talked about a chapter or a section that had a big red cross put through it. I don't know if you have time to talk about that.
Yeah. Wow. That's thank you for I was on a podcast the other day that I didn't know much about it when I said yes to it. Apparently it has an audience, which is great. So thanks to Nick from New Books Network. Yeah. So Nick asked this wonderful question, and it was wonderful because it's just not a question. He got into the mechanics of book writing, and apart from the content, he wanted to know what was it like, working with my editor, and what was the process of coming up with this material like. And I described, I had worked with my editor, the lovely and talented Leo Hollis, on a previous book that we did for Verso called Radical Technologies: The Design of Everyday Life. And I mean, that book was like a hot knife through butter by comparison. Everything else I have previously written, I think this is my 5th book, everything by comparison was like a hot knife through butter. And the reason is that it was in a critical mode. This is the first book I've ever written where I'm affirming something that I do believe, a state of affairs that I do want to see happen. And you're just much more vulnerable like that. It's a much more exposed place to be in. So I have a lot of appreciation for anybody who's willing to kind of go on the record and say what it is that they do believe and do want to have happen. I did that, and there was originally another kind of prefatory chapter up front, right after the chapter on the long emergency, right after the chapter about all of the cascading and intertangled crises that confront us. And it was about what is the most likely political response that I see happening to all of this. You know, fine, Greenfield, you've said, you know, all of this stuff about political and social and economic collapse, but really, you know, what's the most likely thing that happens? And that chapter was about what I think is still, frankly, the most likely thing that happens, which is eco-fascism, which is revanchist eco-fascism in the ascendant everywhere, and an attempt to get a handle on climate while doing so without any regard for justice or equity or the values that I personally cherish. And it was about particularly the Great Replacement theory and what used to be called lifeboat ethics and the racist underpinnings of some important voices in ecology and ecological thought, including people who are heroes to some of my friends, including some very well-known names. And I went on to develop this into a theory that I called nihility salience. I've already said I don't like jargon. Here I am, my own worst enemy, you know, jargonizing with the best of them. And my editor just, you know, and this was like a long chapter that, you know, really came from the heart. And my editor took, I don't know, day or two and just sent it back to me, like literally X'd out. He's like, no, nobody, you know, if you think people are going to make it through that first chapter, you know, you're already, you're giving them a lot. If you're going to hit them with that and then tell them that the most likely thing that happens is that they spend the rest of their life laboring under fascism, and that everything else that you have to say is just kind of the best we can hope for under the circumstances, you know, people are not going to merely drop this book; they're going to hurl it across the room in rage. And he's right. I think he's right. I think that material ultimately would have weakened the argument of this book. Because it's not, as I say, it's not about giving people more reasons to dread getting up in the morning. It's about discovering all of the well springs of our power, and our power not merely as people who are developing our own capacities in this moment, but our power as collectives and as communities that are coming together. So
Right.
that's what that was about.
Adam, so I think we've got a few questions there. I think Shane disappeared but has beamed back, and he did have his hand up earlier. And there's a few bits. So Shane, are you up for yeah, Shane, go for a question, and let's keep questions and feedback, Adam, a little succinct.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and a really good reminder of how sort of mutual aid makes people feel good, and it reminded me of sort of community centres and squatter community centres, which I sort of took life houses to be something similar to, but I don't know if I haven't read the book. But if it is the case, is there any sort of life houses centres that are going on in the United States? As you know, there's sort of the climate emergency centres here, which Phoenix has been very instrumental in. And second question is, I don't know what the sort of local politics situation is like in the States, and whether Occupy people, you know, got involved in local politics. But certainly in Britain, local politics at a town and parish level is very, very easy to get elected. And they have less financial constrictions than county councils and district councils, which are very bright. So, you know, certainly in Frome, a lot of the good stuff is coming through the town council, and I wonder if anything like that has happened in the States, that people are going into very local politics as a result of it.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. The first thing is I realize that I haven't so far defined exactly what I think a Lifehouse ought to be, which is inspired directly by the church, the repurposed church that we worked in Occupy Sandy. It is a disaster relief and recovery hub. It is a logistical warehouse for supplies. It is a place where people can get physical shelter from storms. It is a place where people can get access to, to food and to warmth or cooling, depending on what is needed. But it's also a place that generates its own power. And it's also a place that has some capacity to do things like purifying drinking water. It has some technical components as well. And all of this is democratically organized and managed by assembly. That's the compact vision of the Lifehouse. And the good news is there are places like this all over, not merely in the United States, but here in the UK. I mean, right here in London, in Camden, there's something called the Cooperation Town Hub, which is as close to a functioning Lifehouse as anything I've ever seen. It is in a nursery that the council gave up, and they've kind of, semi-illicitly appropriated it. I mean, they've, with the consent of the council, but they've got, a community living room and a food, co-op, and even an organic farm and a bike workshop. And they have all of these things kind of operating together, run by the people who use them. So it's incredibly inspiring. There are examples like this all over the map. And part of my hope in writing the book is in knitting them together and in making them aware of one another, because I think that there's another sense in which the word the phrase mutual aid is sometimes used. It's sometimes used by like fire departments or emergency service departments to discuss their ability to help one another out in times of need and to share resources. And my feeling is that to the extent that these hubs exist, they ought to be able to participate in a network that not merely works collectively at the local level, but collectively at the larger scale and brings them together in a way that allows them to share resources. As to local politics, yeah, I mean, I make no bones about the fact that I'm not an electoralist, really. I mean, I vote as harm reduction, but I don't place a whole lot of faith in electoral politics to deliver the sorts of life critical services that we need. And the argument that the book makes is explicit on this point. I say I'm not interested in relitigating what the left has been doing going back to the First International. I'm not interested in asking the question, should the state furnish the lineaments of a decent existence, or ought it, or could it? All I'm interested in asking in this book is, in the situation that we're in here and now, is it likely that the state will furnish the lineaments of a decent and dignified existence? And in the event that it is not likely, that we conclude that it is not likely, that we fend for ourselves and we organize for ourselves. I'm not averse to political parties, to local councils, to government entities of any sort, participating and contributing productively to these efforts. But ultimately, one of the lessons I learned from the Greek experience is that even a friendly state, when it comes along, there's language that Microsoft used to use about independent software developers. They used to say, we're going to embrace and extend, what you're doing. You don't have the resources, so we've got the resources. We're going to come along and we're going to embrace and extend what you're doing. And software developers cynically always used to extend that by one. They say, okay, embrace, extend, and extinguish, because that's what wound up happening. And the analogy to what happens when the state gets involved with mutual aid efforts is sadly very much like that. And we see this in Greece, for example, where there was this bottom-up solidarity network. The state attempted to take it on, and they wound up embracing it, extending it, and extinguishing it to the extent that it does not have that same capacity now as they did.
Adam, there's a bit of a similar story there with the COVID mutual aid groups here. They were originally set up by anarchist groups. It grew very fast, and then suddenly you had councils jumping on board. They grew to about 2,000 mutual aid groups, helping people with food and visiting people who are lonely and connecting. And it grew to about 2,000 groups. But then you had councils recommending people get in touch with these mutual aid groups. They didn't know the roots of where they started. Should we come over to Roman and then James? We've got a few questions there and feedback. I'd like to chip a few bits in towards the end as well. Roman, Lovely to see you beaming in from Hull.
Yeah. Thank you very much, man. Nice to see you too, Phoenix, and you too, Shane. Loads of familiar faces. Yeah, sorry, I won't take up time. My kind of in two parts. One was around kind of Rojava, and what do you think are some of the main lessons that we could sort of focus on trying to translate to like a British context or a European context, and then also was going to ask about what are the kind of priorities that we need to be focusing on before these crisis moments as well, and like what is it that has allowed the mutual aid networks in Greece to sort of, you know, take on 30%, I think you said, of the kind of like state services, or you know, in yeah, even here, say COVID, but like there wasn't that pre-organizing beforehand, you know what I mean, to sort of lay the foundations for things that could continue. And then same in Rojava, obviously it was a crisis moment they responded to with the civil war, but what was the kind of priority organizing that was taking place before those semi-unpredictable moments that allowed those organizations to really develop those long-term foundations?
Yeah, I'm going to answer both those questions in the same way because the answer is the same. The lesson that we can learn from Rojava and the way that they did things there, and the things that we could be doing right now, are in fact organizing in local assemblies. But there is an absolute precondition for this, and this is why I've been, with all due respect to those of you who I know are working very hard on citizens' assemblies, and I go into this in some detail in the book, that the absolute precondition for a successful assembly is that it be dispositive of real material resource. It cannot, must not simply be a talking shop to proffer recommendations to a municipal authority or to get the sense of a community. It has to actually decide questions of import organically and for itself. Given that is the making of a real nexus of constituent power, of a kernel of something which can grow and be propagated across an entire society. The way that it worked in Rojava, and something that I really do hope that people here start working on, that the nub of it is what they call the justice platform there, which is a way of thinking about reparative and restorative justice in the community. We will not cease to have conflicts with our neighbors. You know, we will not cease to have tensions and controversies. And, you know, we know, even if you believe in the police service, even if you believe in public order and public safety as delivered from above, the capacity of these systems is clearly, you know, they're at breaking point. So, and I believe it's an absolute ethical minimum that you know, people have the right to be safe in their communities. Everybody has that right. So we need to understand that these two things are in fact intimately related with one another. Our ability to come together as assemblies to manage our own affairs, and also to begin to reframe safety and security and public safety as furnished by ourselves for ourselves. I think if we develop this infrastructure now, we have a much better chance of making it through some of the really scarier stuff that happens.
I suppose that's part of what the Collapse Aware group is talking about, is preparing these systems and infrastructure before these things happen. It's part of what we're doing with the climate emergency centres, is building an infrastructure that can work on, you know, the solutions and working towards, you know, dealing with the storms that are coming in.
So I just want to circle back very quickly.
Finish off, and then we'll come to James and Helen. Over. Go on, Adam.
Absolutely. It was Occupy Wall Street that allowed Occupy Sandy to stand up so quickly. So it's the networks that you're forging right now that will, you know, when the crisis comes, and it will come, you know, you'll be able to stand up these relations, and the conversations that you're having right now will function as the nexus of the survival systems that see you through the things to come. That's all I wanted to say about that.
Absolutely. On the first day of Occupy, 900 cities had occupations going on, having people's assemblies, horizontal organising. I heard from a BBC journalist that day. I couldn't believe it, 900 cities. We have the capacity to link up 3,000 cities having horizontal people's assemblies, sharing the information digitally. and building these resilient networks and spaces, life houses, climate emergency centres, spaces where people can meet and organise. It's what we need. Let's keep networking, folks. Over to James. You've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm going to be a bit cheeky and ask two questions. But firstly, I like what you said around what happened in Greece, where a community or the public, or almost a commune, created this new kind of technology and investigated into this new system. And then when the state came in, they limited it in a similar way to private corporations did. In the study of economics, we often talk about public and private sector forms of development and technological development. But what's lost in capitalism is often the commune element of development. And while I'm a supporter of the public sector in the elements of development and state intervention into trying to create technologies, in fact, we can see this all around us, the internet. The reason why I'm talking to you right now, much of the developments that we have are from the public sector, whereas the private sector, in the free market, cannot plan for the future, only the next profit margin. But I did find that really interesting, that we do need to look outwards from just this binary view of public and private, and also into the commune sector, not just around state control. And this factors into my second question. And it was lovely to hear you talking about Rojava. And not enough people are talking about it. Barely anyone knows it exists. So I was really, really happy to hear that you talking about it. And I view it as a very successful form of libertarian socialist policies. But you mind if I ask around the ideas of libertarian socialism, in that, well, with libertarian socialism, the brilliant thing about it is obviously it allows for a significant degree of pluralism and diversity. It allows for more direct democracy, I think is the term, and which has proven to be in Rojava a very effective form. But with theories of democratic socialism, for example, where it's more state control and state authority, for example, through a planned economy, how realistic do you think, to implement a planned economy in a system like Rojava and develop that already very successful system, like you say, even further to make more eco-socialist and even more progressive ideas, not just through communes and individual communities, but also perhaps through state intervention and overall governments? And which one do you think is more effective? Do you think there needs to be more commune empowerment or more state empowerment in Rojava?
So again, the answer to your second question is kind of the answer to your first. The reason why we're speaking over the internet right now isn't simply a matter of state intervention, although it is true that the United States Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, the ARPANET, was the original foundation for some of this material. You're forgetting, when you divide things into public and private, there is the commons. There is the commons sector. What percentage of web servers are running Apache, for example, open source software that was done in the commons? I think it's over 80% of web servers. Something like 90% of content delivering websites use WordPress, which is an open source platform. All of these things were done in the commons. And so I have some sympathy for the public sector. I have some sympathy for even small businesses in the private sector, but I really do think it's the commons where innovation comes from. It's the commons where solidarity comes from, and it's in the commons that we're going to find more of the answers we need for more of the problems we face. As you'll tell from a cursory glance at the book, I'm not a statist at all. I don't place much hope at this moment in state action. I think that certainly even the friendliest of states tends to be oppressive to people who don't fit in, who don't fit its models, who don't fit its interpretive grids. And, just on behalf of myself and all of the other people who have never really quite fit in anywhere, I'm just uncomfortable with centralized power of any sort, whether public or private. And my entire political trajectory has been about how you decentralize power and how you prevent accumulations of power. So I think that not merely in Rojava, but elsewhere, I don't want to see states taking on a greater responsibility for things. I think that they, are good at some things. Certainly, during the post-war years in the United States and the United Kingdom, the welfare state was the largest peacetime expansion of living standards ever seen in any population. But now we pay the price for that ecologically. So, I'm not a statist and I'm not a fan. And I believe that genuine meaning and value come from using our human capacities to the greatest possible extent, and we cannot do that as passive subjects of a state. We have to do that as active contributors to a commons. That's just my belief.
Pick up the commons. Coming over to Helen there, and then double Helen. And just to say, we can do this. We've done this before. Occupy had thousands of cities occupied and self-organising and mutual aid. Helen, up to the Leeds team.
Is it me?
No, sorry, Helen Hart, then Helen Sutton is on my screen in order.
So, yeah, you've actually answered some of the things I was going to say, but I think the one thing we really need to work on, and I'm hoping that's what Gail's talking about with her group, is when we had COVID, yes, a lot of councils did step up and they used like voluntary action leads to do it round our way, and loads of people volunteered, which shows we've got all these people who do it, and then it just went gone. So I think we've got to work out how to be ready if there is another emergency, how to be ready to pull those people, not just from doing that one temporary thing when there's a hurricane or the COVID or whatever it is, but how to get those people involved.
Oh, very important, all fronts. Do you want to say something there, Adam? And then we'll come to Helen, and we're going to wrap up in a little bit soon, or we can ask if people want to spend a bit more time and questions.
Is that my hope that if there is some, a local Lifehouse or some equivalent of that getting involved in running that is how people maintain that connection, between the crises. My sense, sadly, is that there won't be much time between crises, and that in the epoch that we've entered, the mean time between major disruptive events is dropping to zero, and that there will almost always be something meaningful and useful we can do for one another in the context of a Lifehouse. I have to say that it's different here than it is in the States. All right, I've lived here for 10 years, and I truly believe that I will spend, I hope I'm not, I think I'm going to spend the rest of my life here, and I hope it's a long and healthy life, I'll put it that way. But it is an uphill battle. And we saw this in the COVID mutual aid organizing. It's an uphill battle here to convince people that it's okay for them to do this stuff on their own behalf. There is this very deep recourse to, oh, well, this is something that we can let the council take care of, or it's better if the council takes on responsibility for this. They'll, people won't fall through the cracks that way. And, I'm always moved to ask, what about the people who are falling through the cracks now when the council does take care of things? I think that it is a much harder lift, frankly, in the UK than it is in the States, where one of the beneficial qualities of the kind of rugged individualism, there's many, many, many downsides to it, but one of the upsides is that it's not a big ask to get people to learn how to do kind of basic self-reliance and self-sufficiency. That's something that's kind of wired into the DNA of settler colonialist North America. If we can get people here thinking along those lines, and thinking particularly for those of your friends who are invested in labor, who are invested in the Lib Dems, I'm sure you have them, that it's not betraying those movements. It's not betraying the energy that they put into those movements to also and at the same time self-organize in their communities, that they're not taking anything away. They can still vote, they can still participate, they can still, write letters to their counselor or come to the surgery. They can, they don't have to sever that part of themselves completely. But I promise them that working in Lifehouse is a different way of being, and that ultimately it will feel like it's making a lot more of a difference in their lives.
Yeah. I think we need cooperation on all fronts between as many different groups as possible very, very fast. We're reaching all of the tipping points, and we need these spaces, these life houses, climate emergency centres, community spaces to meet together, to organise and to get on with the solutions and deal with the storms that are rapidly coming our way. So we sort of, is the group all right to carry on for another kind of 10 minutes or so? It's very fascinating tonight. Some people may have to or have had to beam out or go, but is the group okay to carry on for 10? And also, I'd like to thank Gail for linking up Adam tonight, and wondered if she wanted towards the end any parting comment or anything you wanted to share there. So, there, Helen, was that your
Well,
question? Yeah.
Lovely if you could hang on for me, yeah.
Yes, go get Helen.
So I was just responding just quickly to Roman's thing about what you call the other sector, because all the different names like third sector, commons, and solidarity sector is something I've heard used a lot if you want to get kind of formalistic about what do you call it. But the thing that made me put my hand up was, Adam, when you said about the assembly needs to have a matter of import. And when I was involved in a community garden, it really relates to what you last said as well, that the people within the community wanted to know who was funding it. Like, they wanted there to be another, like, it wasn't important enough that they had a site that they could develop, that they could then get funding because they were a community with a space. And it's like, there are spaces, but then there's no community, or there are communities, but there are no spaces. If you see what I mean, it's that making that connection between the two and not having people turn to you and say, well, who's funding this? Because they want to feel validated by that. I don't know. Maybe I'm projecting here, but that need for an external kind of endorsement.
Yeah.
It's good points, Helen. So I just want to cut across here to, I think Gail's got to go soon. So I was just going to see if Gail wanted to weigh in anything there with some of her feedback, comments or anything over there. Thanks very much for linking Adam up, Gail. Brilliant.
I'll listen to Christine and then I'll go. I put in the chat, folks, a way for people to follow up from this. And it's obvious there's a close link between climate emergency centres, the concept of life houses, the idea of collapse awareness and social preparing. And some of us have been doing some talking and thinking about this for a little bit and can feel the potential of a sort of movement really that wants to build around this, that could actually also be about power and making change. So I was just so delighted to read Adam's book. I was like, yeah, this is what I wanted to read. So I sort of phoned him up and dragged him down a pub at ASAP. So thanks, Phoenix, for really running with getting this talk off the ground. I have a feeling we might be launching a new movement tonight, but you never know, do you? One lives in hope. So lots of love. I'll just listen in for the answer to Helen's question, Christine, and then I will jump off. Because I'm going to go and meet with dear old Alan from the Network for Social Change tomorrow, who are looking at this area as well. So there's lots brewing, folks.
Brilliant. I just spent most of the day finishing off a quick one for the Network for Social Change, who hopefully might help us out. We're a quick plug for, we always need more help, support and funding for climate emergency centres and things. Just to bung a couple of bits in there, we'll come over to you in a sec, Christine, just to say, and Adam, you know, final comments, kind of feedback kind of thing, but just to say, you know, it sounds like great work what you're doing, and learning from all these different movements is really important. And as someone who personally has been running many of these centres, it's always a collective of people, a circle of people, a movement of people through many of these different movements since the 90s, you know, from the road protest to anti-war to climate justice, climate camps, on to Occupy, anti-fracking, on into, you know, Extinction Rebellion and climate emergency centres. Many of these waves of movements have built upon each other and helped each other and learned from each other. And we are what we are now. We stand on the shoulders of giants because of the Greenham Common women and the actions they did and the way they did things. And because Occupy was a massive inspiration to me. You know, we scarcely could have dreamt in the old days of Reclaim the Streets in the 90s that you would get, you know, 900 cities occupied with assemblies going on. And to me, that first day and every day of Occupy was a massive success, to have people learning about horizontal organising, going off doing actions, occupying other spaces. And we watched the videos of the American police smashing up Occupy in America really, really, really heavy-handedly, going into the parks and trashing tents and people. And it just shows you how scared certain 1%, or, you know, about everyone cooperating, but there is a small 1% who are very, very scared of people power and direct democracy and horizontal organising. And people do have the power, and we could be setting up 3,000 people's assemblies. You know, we are a movement of movements, you know. Anti-globalization time, we put 250,000 people on the streets of Genoa. That was a mass movement. And before that, we had indie media, 140 odd independent media centres, which help everyone to report the news and be part of it. And this is what we need. The first rainbow centres that climate emergency centres came from started in a couple of squatty churches and many other buildings. So we need to keep in space.
Rainbow, I was trying to remember what it was called, the Rainbow Centre, yeah.
Big up the Rainbow Centre team, Kentish Town, Book of the Dread, Shane, South London, Brixton, Cooltown, Christine, and then over to Adam for final parting comments. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's been really inspiring. Christine, then Adam for final roundup. Over.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thank you. That was really inspiring, really, you know, inspirational. Yeah, what I was kind of worried about or querying was the angle that you were coming in about the kind of your weariness of the state and things like that. And I know you said that, you know, the welfare state was really great, the post-war project, and then that brought us climate change. But actually, I don't think that came from the welfare state. I think that came from the Industrial Revolution, which was 100 years before that. You could say that's the tail end of it. You know, so I don't think you can appropriate climate change to the welfare state more to, you know, where it started at the Industrial Revolution. Because my problem is, or my question is, you know, if we keep chipping away at the state, if we keep attacking the state, which, you know, of course it has loads of issues, what happens in that chasm? You know, if we manage to dismantle UK and America or whatever, you know, what in that chasm, you've seen Putin today at the BRIC conference saying that there was going to be a new world order. Did you hear it? Literal, actual phrase. In the morning, he said there'll be a new, he said something else and it was indicating towards that way. And then by the evening, he literally had said, we are trying to recreate a new world order. You know, so I guess my question is kind of like, you know, we do need revolution, but it's that old Fabianism, you know, like that. Let's take an evolutionary approach to it and don't throw out the baby with the bathwater kind of thing, you know? Does that make sense?
All right, Adam, the revolutionary comment towards the end, revolutionary evolutionaries. Adam, if you want to answer a bit of that, but also do your sum up final comments. I think it's been really exciting tonight, lots of really good input, and please fill out the jot form that has been posted there by Gail a couple of times himself. Adam, thank you very much for coming. If you'd like to go to final parting comments, feedback, summary, thank you very much for coming. Let's keep networking spaces for the people then. Over.
I want to make a quick comment about the welfare state. It's not that it's responsible for global.
No.
It's that it is it's founded on a productivist set of assumptions. And I don't share that productivist set of assumptions. I'm a degrowthist by nature. So you know, let's not yes, throw out the baby with the bathwater, but let's also remember that there's a master framework behind the welfare state that I just simply don't share. More broadly, the question here again isn't should the state provide for us? It's will the state provide for us when we need it to? And on that count, many times in my life, I've seen that it will not. It has failed to do so. And there are times in which it is actively opposed to the cause of justice and the achievement of human dignity. You don't need to be a racialized other. You don't need to be a subaltern population to understand that the force of the state is not always arrayed in defense of human dignity, but very, very often it's suppressing it. And I think that, you know, it's not for me to weigh the final tally on whether the state is a good or a not good thing in human history. That's not the point of the book. And that's frankly a question that I don't think any one of us will answer. And I think it's just not even a helpful path to go down. It's a very concrete thing. In your community tonight, are there people who are not being served by the council? Are you, yes or no, being served by the council? Are all of your psychic and material needs being seen to? And if they're not, what can we do about that together? That's the project of the book. And, you know, whether it leads to something else, I don't know. I won't be alive to see it. You know, Phoenix has already pointed out, you know, that we've had a procession of these movements even in the last 30, 40 years. And many of us, you know, here on this call have lived through those movements. I mean, I got started in ACT UP Philadelphia. My first arrest was for, you know, protesting Ronald Reagan. You know, we remember these movements, right? Like Critical Mass was another one. Indie Media, you know, my girlfriend was one of the first indie media people in Philadelphia at that time. So you know, these the movement is just a stepping stone towards something else. With every movement, I think we get a little bit more sophisticated about our tactics. I think we get a little bit more ambitious about how it is that we want to take on responsibility for ourselves. And I think that we build structures, systems, tools, and processes, and we leave them on the ground at the end of the day for other people to pick up and make use of. And in a nutshell, that is the project of the book. My only hope for this book is that it's a toolkit and a set of inspirations and maybe a couple of practical methods for how to build your own sense that this is something you can survive and you can help other people survive as well, and that you can feel empowered through that. And that carries you through the rest of your days on Earth, as I hope it carries me through the rest of my days on Earth. That's it. Thank you so much for having me. I do hope you, if anything that we've discussed here tonight, follow up. There is a Google Doc, I think that's being promulgated for capturing contact. Scale's got that. I am going to ask that somebody captures all of the comments in the chat, because as soon as I get off the call, I'm going to want to read those, and I haven't had a chance to look at them so far. I thank you very, very much for your attention, for your concerted and considered and patient questions and challenges, and let's do great things together. Thank you very much. Good night.
Beautiful, Adam. I'm going to stop the recording there. Let's hope we can all build these spaces together, survive and thrive into the future.